Hash the challenge Major, Rodriguez's impossible mission. The desert heat shimmered off the tarmac at Bagram Airfield as Major Sarah Rodriguez walked toward her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The morning briefing had been unlike any other in her 12 years of military service. What started as routine close air support had transformed into something that would test every skill she had learned as a pilot. Sarah had earned her call sign Phoenix after surviving a bird strike during a training mission that would have ended most pilots' careers. Instead of ejecting, she had nursed her damaged aircraft back to base, landing with one engine completely destroyed. That incident had taught her something valuable about herself. She thrived when others expected her to fail. The mission briefing room had been packed with senior officers, intelligence analysts, and a group of Navy SEALs who looked like they had seen too much combat. Team leader Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hammer Thompson had laid out the situation with military precision. A CIA operative had been captured deep in Taliban territory, held in a compound surrounded by mountains and anti-aircraft weapons. The terrain made helicopter insertion impossible, and conventional airstrikes would kill the hostage. The SEALs needed something different. They needed someone who could fly lower than anyone thought possible, deliver precision strikes that would create chaos, and allow the ground team to extract their target. The mission required flying through a narrow canyon system at an altitude that defied conventional wisdom about A-10 operations. Chief Thompson had looked directly at Sarah during the briefing, his weathered face showing skepticism. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we've worked with A-10 pilots before. What you're proposing is physically impossible. Those aircraft aren't designed for terrain-following flight at 50 feet above ground level. The margin for error doesn't exist." Sarah had studied the reconnaissance photos spread across the briefing table. The target compound sat in a valley surrounded by rocky walls that rose over 300 feet on both sides. The only approach that wouldn't trigger every surface-to-air missile in the region required flying through Devil's Canyon, a winding passage barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, her squadron commander, had supported her assessment but warned about the risks. "Phoenix, you know your aircraft better than anyone, but this mission is asking you to operate outside every safety parameter we've established. One wrong calculation, one moment of turbulence, and you won't have time to recover." The intelligence officer had provided additional details about the target. The compound held approximately 40 enemy fighters, multiple vehicle-mounted weapons, and sophisticated air defense systems. The hostage was being held in a central building that required surgical precision to avoid civilian casualties. The weather window was closing fast, with a sandstorm expected to arrive within 6 hours. Sarah had requested additional reconnaissance flights to study the canyon approach. The images revealed wind patterns that could work in her favor if she timed everything perfectly. The narrow walls would create updrafts and downdrafts that could either help or destroy her mission. Understanding these air currents would be critical to maintaining control at such low altitude. The SEALs had expressed concerns about coordinating with an Air Force pilot they had never worked with before. Their previous experiences had involved routine close air support from safe altitudes, not the kind of precision flying Sarah was proposing. Chief Thompson had made it clear that his team's lives depended on perfect execution. Preparing for the mission required modifications to her standard loadout. Instead of the typical mix of high-explosive ordnance, Sarah selected precision-guided munitions that could create maximum psychological impact with minimal collateral damage. Her 30 GAU-8 cannon would provide the suppressive fire needed for the SEAL insertion. The weather forecast added another layer of complexity. Morning thermal conditions would create unpredictable air currents in the canyon, while the approaching sandstorm meant she had only one opportunity to complete the mission. Failure would leave the hostage in enemy hands and potentially compromise future rescue operations. Sarah spent hours reviewing technical manuals and flight characteristics data for low-altitude operations. The A-10 had been designed for close air support, but what she was planning pushed the aircraft beyond its intended operational parameters. She calculated fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and emergency procedures for every possible scenario. The mission planning session continued past midnight as Sarah worked with intelligence analysts to identify precise target coordinates. Every building in the compound had been mapped and assigned priority levels based on the rescue operation timeline. The margin for error measured in seconds, not minutes. Chief Thompson had pulled her aside after the final briefing. "Major, I've seen a lot of pilots make promises they couldn't keep. My men are going into that valley based on your word that you can provide the cover we need. Are you absolutely certain you can deliver?" Sarah had looked him directly in the eyes, understanding the weight of responsibility she was accepting. "Chief, I've been flying A-10 since I was 23 years old. I know what this aircraft can do, and I know what I can do. Your team will have the support they need." The pre-flight inspection took longer than usual as Sarah checked every system twice. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, had worked with her for 3 years and understood her attention to detail. He had personally verified every component that would be critical for low-altitude flight operations. Walking toward her aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and focus that preceded challenging missions. The A-10 sat ready on the tarmac, loaded with precision ordnance and enough ammunition to provide sustained fire support. Everything depended on her ability to fly lower and more precisely than anyone believed possible. The tower had cleared her for immediate takeoff as soon as she was ready. Weather conditions were optimal for the next 4 hours, after which the approaching sandstorm would make the mission impossible. She had one chance to prove that determination and skill could overcome conventional limitations. Sarah strapped into her ejection seat and began the startup sequence that had become second nature over thousands of flight hours. Today would test whether her reputation as Phoenix was justified, or whether she was about to attempt something that would end her career in the mountains of Afghanistan. Hash into the canyon, testing the impossible. The twin engines of Sarah's A-10 roared to life as she completed her pre-flight checks in the gray light of dawn. Radio chatter filled her headset as the SEAL team confirmed their position at the insertion point 12 miles from the target compound. Chief Thompson's voice carried the tension of a man whose soldiers' lives depended on a plan that defied conventional military wisdom. "Phoenix, Hammer team is in position. We're counting on you to make this work. The hostage intel suggests we have a narrow window before they move him to a different location." Sarah adjusted her flight controls and began taxiing toward the runway. The weight of additional ammunition made the aircraft handle differently, requiring subtle adjustments to her normal procedures. Every pound of ordnance had been carefully calculated to provide maximum effectiveness while maintaining the fuel reserves needed for the low-altitude approach. The takeoff roll felt smooth despite the heavy load. Sarah pulled back on the stick and felt the familiar sensation of the climbing away from the desert floor. The morning air was surprisingly stable, which would help during the critical canyon approach. She had studied weather patterns for this region extensively, knowing that thermal updrafts could create deadly turbulence in narrow spaces. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah began her descent toward Devil's Canyon. The reconnaissance photos had shown her the route, but seeing the terrain firsthand revealed details that no briefing could capture. The canyon walls rose like ancient fortresses, carved by centuries of wind and water into shapes that seemed designed to destroy aircraft. Radio contact with the SEAL team confirmed they were moving into final position. Chief Thompson's men had spent the night infiltrating to within striking distance of the compound. Their success depended entirely on Sarah's ability to create enough confusion and destruction to mask their approach to the hostage location. "Phoenix, we're seeing multiple heat signatures around the target building. Enemy activity is higher than expected, but we're committed to the timeline. How's your approach looking?" Sarah keyed her radio while making final adjustments to her attack profile. "Hammer team, I'm beginning canyon entry now. Initial conditions look good, but I need absolute radio silence during the approach phase unless it's an emergency." The mouth of Devil's Canyon appeared ahead like the entrance to another world. Sarah reduced power and began the most dangerous phase of the mission. At 50 feet above the canyon floor, every rock formation and wind current became a potential threat. The A-10's rugged design had saved countless pilots, but what she was attempting pushed beyond the aircraft's intended operational limits. The canyon walls seemed to close in as Sarah navigated the first series of turns. Wind patterns created by the narrow passage generated unexpected turbulence that required constant control inputs. She had practiced similar approaches during training exercises, but never at this altitude or in terrain this unforgiving. Her altimeter showed readings that would have triggered emergency procedures under normal circumstances. The distance between her aircraft and the rocky canyon floor measured in dozens of feet rather than hundreds. One moment of inattention or equipment failure would leave no time for recovery procedures. The second major turn in the canyon presented the mission's most challenging obstacle. Reconnaissance had shown a narrowing passage where the walls closed to barely wider than her wingspan. Sarah had calculated the precise bank angle needed to navigate this section, but theory and reality often differed when flying at the edge of physics. Engine noise echoed off the canyon walls as Sarah banked into the turn. The A-10 responded precisely to her control inputs despite the challenging conditions. Years of experience had taught her to trust her aircraft and her training, even when every instinct suggested the impossibility of what she was attempting. Emerging from the narrow section, Sarah saw the target valley opening ahead. The compound appeared exactly as described in the intelligence briefings, a cluster of buildings surrounded by defensive positions and vehicle-mounted weapons. Early morning shadows provided some concealment, but she would be completely exposed once she began her attack run. The SEAL team confirmed their readiness for the coordinated assault. Chief Thompson's voice carried the controlled tension of a professional preparing for combat. "Phoenix, we're in position. The hostage is confirmed in the central building. We need maximum chaos in the outer defensive positions to cover our approach." Sarah lined up her first attack run while maintaining her incredibly low altitude. The element of surprise was critical. Once the enemy realized an aircraft was in the valley, every weapon would turn skyward. She had perhaps 30 seconds to deliver maximum damage before the situation became exponentially more dangerous. The GAU-8 cannon spun up to firing speed as Sarah acquired her first target. A truck-mounted machine gun position anchored the compound's eastern defenses, manned by fighters who had no idea death was approaching at 300 miles per hour just feet above the ground. Her first burst of 30 rounds struck with devastating accuracy. The explosive shells turned the defensive position into twisted metal and smoke, creating the opening shock that would define the entire engagement. Sarah immediately banked hard left to avoid return fire while lining up her second target. Radio chatter from the SEAL team indicated they were using the confusion to advance toward the hostage building. Chief Thompson's men moved with practiced efficiency, exploiting every moment of chaos Sarah's attack created. The coordination between air and ground forces was working exactly as planned. A surface-to-air missile launch lit up Sarah's threat warning system. Flying this low had advantages and disadvantages. While missiles had difficulty acquiring lock-on, any that did manage to track her aircraft would have minimal flight time before impact. She deployed chaff and flares while maintaining her attack profile. The missile passed harmlessly overhead as Sarah continued her strafing run. Her second target, a communications building, disappeared in a cloud of debris and smoke. The precision of her attacks was creating exactly the kind of localized destruction. The mission required maximum impact on defensive capabilities with minimal risk to the hostage. Enemy fighters began emerging from buildings and defensive positions, some firing small arms wildly into the sky. Their confusion was evident as they struggled to understand how an aircraft had appeared in their protected valley without warning. The psychological impact of Sarah's sudden appearance was as valuable as the physical damage her weapons delivered. Sarah pulled into a climbing turn to set up her next attack run. The SEAL team reported successful penetration of the compound's outer perimeter and movement toward the hostage building. Everything was proceeding according to plan, but the most dangerous phase of the mission was just beginning. Under fire precision in chaos. The valley erupted in chaos as enemy fighters realized they were under attack from an aircraft that had appeared without warning. Sarah banked her A-10 into a steep climbing turn, using the canyon walls to mask her position while setting up for her next attack run. Radio chatter from the SEAL team indicated they had successfully breached the compound's outer defenses during the confusion her first strikes had created. "Phoenix, Hammer team is inside the perimeter. We've got multiple tangos converging on the hostage building. Need immediate suppression of the north courtyard defensive positions." Sarah rolled inverted to get a clear view of the target area while maintaining her low altitude advantage. The north courtyard contained 2 heavy machine gun nests and what appeared to be a crew-served weapons system that could threaten both the rescue team and her aircraft. Eliminating these positions required precision strikes that would clear the path without damaging the building containing the hostage. Anti-aircraft fire began filling the valley as enemy fighters recovered from their initial shock. Tracer rounds streaked past Sarah's canopy as she lined up her attack run. Flying at 50 feet above ground level meant every enemy fighter with a rifle became a potential threat, but it also made her aircraft extremely difficult to track with heavier weapon systems. The GAU-8 cannon roared as Sarah delivered a devastating burst into the first machine gun nest. The 30 rounds obliterated the defensive position, sending chunks of concrete and metal flying across the courtyard. She immediately shifted fire to the second target, walking her rounds across the position with deadly accuracy. Enemy fighters scattered as Sarah's cannon fire swept through their positions. The psychological impact of close air support at such low altitude created panic that multiplied the effectiveness of her actual weapon strikes. Men who had never experienced an A-10 attack at minimum range struggled to maintain organized resistance. Chief Thompson's voice crackled through radio static as his team advanced toward the hostage building. "Phoenix, beautiful work on those gun positions. We're encountering heavy resistance at the main entrance. There's a fortified doorway with multiple shooters. Can you put ordnance on the adjacent building to create a diversion?" Sarah studied the target area through her targeting system while avoiding increasingly heavy ground fire. The adjacent building housed enemy fighters who were reinforcing the main defensive positions, but destroying it required careful placement to avoid damage to the hostage location. She selected a precision-guided munition and began her attack run. The small bomb struck the building's corner with surgical accuracy, collapsing one wall while leaving the structure's main integrity intact. The explosion created a massive dust cloud that concealed the SEAL team's final approach while eliminating the immediate threat from enemy reinforcements. Surface-to-air missile launch warnings filled Sarah's cockpit as enemy air defenses finally began coordinating their response. 2 missiles streaked upward from positions she hadn't identified during her initial reconnaissance. At her current altitude, she had perhaps 3 seconds to react before impact. Sarah pulled into a hard left bank while deploying countermeasures. The first missile passed close enough that she felt its exhaust heat through the canopy, missing by mere feet. The second missile tracked her turn, but lost lock when she ducked behind a rocky outcropping that blocked its guidance system. "Phoenix, we're inside the building. Hostage secured, but we need immediate extraction support. Enemy reinforcements are converging on our position from multiple directions." The rescue phase was complete, but the mission was far from over. The SEAL team now faced the challenge of extracting their recovered hostage while surrounded by enemy fighters who knew exactly where they were located. Sarah needed to provide continuous fire support while the team moved to their extraction point. Radio contact with the extraction helicopter confirmed inbound arrival in 12 minutes. Chief Thompson's team needed to reach a landing zone 400 meters from the compound while carrying a potentially injured hostage and facing organized enemy pursuit. Sarah's job was to clear their path and suppress any organized resistance. A new threat appeared as enemy fighters attempted to set up a roadblock along the extraction route. 2 vehicles loaded with armed men were racing to intercept the SEAL team before they could reach the helicopter landing zone. Sarah rolled into an attack run that would bring her directly over the roadblock position. The 30 cannon spoke again, and the lead vehicle disappeared in a fireball that sent the second truck careening off the road. The explosion created a crater that would prevent any other vehicles from using that route, effectively sealing off one avenue of enemy pursuit. Enemy small arms fire intensified as Sarah continued providing overwatch for the moving SEAL team. Rifle rounds sparked off her aircraft's armor plating, but the A-10's legendary durability allowed her to maintain her attack profile despite accumulating damage. Warning lights began illuminating her instrument panel as systems registered hits. "Phoenix, we're taking heavy fire from a building complex 200 meters east of the compound. Multiple shooters with automatic weapons are pinning us down. We need that position eliminated to continue movement." Sarah identified the target building and realized it presented her most challenging engagement yet. The structure was partially concealed by terrain features, requiring an attack run that would expose her aircraft to concentrated fire from multiple positions. The SEAL team's survival depended on her willingness to accept maximum risk. Banking into a steep dive, Sarah lined up her most dangerous attack run of the mission. Enemy tracers filled the air around her aircraft as she committed to an approach that offered no margin for error. The building appeared in her gun sight as she prepared to deliver the precise fire support that would save the rescue team. The GAU-8 cannon unleashed its full fury as Sarah held her attack run despite withering ground fire. Her rounds swept through the building complex, silencing the enemy positions that had been threatening the SEAL team. Chunks of concrete and dust filled the air as the structure partially collapsed under the devastating fire. Sarah pulled out of her attack run with new warning lights indicating additional system damage. Hydraulic pressure was dropping, and her flight controls were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The accumulated damage from ground fire was beginning to affect her aircraft's performance, but the mission required her continued presence over the battlefield. The extraction helicopter appeared on the horizon as Chief Thompson's team reached the designated landing zone. The most critical phase of the mission was about to begin, protecting the vulnerable helicopter while it landed and loaded the rescue team. Sarah prepared for what might be her final attack runs of the day. The extraction, protecting the vulnerable. The MH-60 Black Hawk appeared as a speck against the morning sky, growing larger as it approached the landing zone where Chief Thompson's team waited with their rescued hostage. Sarah maintained her orbit around the valley, scanning for threats while managing her increasingly damaged aircraft. Hydraulic fluid leaked steadily from her port engine, and several flight control systems were operating on backup power. Dustoff 7-2, Phoenix. Be advised, landing zone is currently secure, but enemy forces are regrouping approximately 600 meters south of your position. I'm seeing vehicle movement and what appears to be crew-served weapons being repositioned. The helicopter pilot acknowledged her warning while beginning his approach to the rocky clearing where the SEAL team had established a defensive perimeter. The CIA operative they had rescued appeared conscious, but required medical attention that only the helicopter's flight medic could provide during the extraction flight. Sarah's threat warning system activated as enemy air defenses attempted to acquire the vulnerable helicopter. A surface-to-air missile team had managed to set up on high ground overlooking the landing zone, presenting an immediate threat to the extraction aircraft. The missile system's radar was painting both aircraft, searching for the optimal firing solution. Dustoff 7-2, you have SAM threat bearing 270 degrees from your position. I'm engaging immediately. Rolling into an attack run that would bring her directly over the missile position, Sarah accepted that she was flying into a concentrated air defense environment with a damaged aircraft. Her port engine was running rough, and hydraulic pressure continued to drop, but the helicopter crew's survival depended on eliminating the missile threat. The GAU-8 cannon fired its longest burst of the mission as Sarah concentrated her attack on the missile position. The 30 rounds obliterated the launcher and its crew, but not before additional warning lights illuminated her instrument panel. Enemy return fire had struck her starboard engine intake, causing power fluctuations that made precise flight control increasingly difficult. Chief Thompson's voice filled the radio as his team prepared to board the extraction helicopter. Phoenix, we're loading the package now. Hostage is conscious and mobile. We need 30 seconds to get everyone secured for departure. Those 30 seconds stretched into an eternity as Sarah maintained overwatch despite her aircraft's deteriorating condition. Enemy fighters were advancing on the landing zone from multiple directions, using the terrain to conceal their approach until they were within effective range of small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. A new threat emerged as an enemy technical vehicle mounted with a heavy machine gun crested a ridge line with clear line of sight to the landing zone. The helicopter was completely vulnerable during the loading process, unable to take evasive action while the SEAL team embarked with their rescued operative. Sarah banked hard left to engage the technical vehicle, but her damaged flight controls responded sluggishly. The aircraft's normal agility was compromised, requiring her to compensate with throttle inputs and aggressive use of her remaining control surfaces. The port engine's power output was becoming increasingly unreliable. Her attack run on the technical vehicle required flying directly through a gauntlet of small arms fire from enemy positions scattered across the ridgeline. Sarah held her course despite tracer rounds streaking past her canopy and the distinctive crack of rifle rounds striking her aircraft's armor. The heavy machine gun position disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris as Sarah's cannon found its mark. The technical vehicle rolled down the hillside, its crew eliminated and its weapons silenced. But the engagement had cost her aircraft additional damage, and new warning alarms indicated critical systems were approaching failure thresholds. Dustoff 72 is lifting off with the package, all personnel secured and departing the area. Sarah watched the Black Hawk clear the landing zone and begin climbing toward safer altitude. The extraction phase was complete, but her own situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Both engines were now running rough, hydraulic pressure had dropped to minimum levels, and her electrical systems were showing signs of battle damage. Enemy fighters continued their advance despite the successful extraction, apparently determined to exact revenge on the aircraft that had destroyed their defensive positions. Multiple rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the air as Sarah attempted to clear the valley, but her damaged aircraft lacked the performance to quickly escape the threat environment. Phoenix, this is Hammer 6. We're clear of the immediate area, but we can see your aircraft trailing smoke. What's your status? Sarah assessed her instrument panel while fighting to maintain control of her increasingly unresponsive aircraft. Oil pressure in the port engine was dropping rapidly. Electrical systems were intermittent, and her backup flight controls were the only thing keeping her airborne. Hammer 6, Phoenix. I've sustained significant battle damage but remain mission capable for now. I'm going to attempt to clear the valley and make it back to base. The reality was more serious than she was willing to admit over the radio. Her aircraft was in critical condition, and reaching Bagram Airfield would require nursing a severely damaged A-10 across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. But the mission had been successful, the hostage was free, and the SEAL team was safe. Sarah began a careful climb out of the valley, using every remaining advantage her aircraft possessed while avoiding the areas where enemy air defenses remained active. The A-10's legendary durability was being tested to its absolute limits, but the aircraft continued flying despite damage that would have downed less rugged machines. Radio contact with base operations confirmed that emergency services were being prepared for her return. The extent of her aircraft's damage was becoming apparent to ground controllers tracking her flight path and monitoring her radio transmissions. Emergency procedures were already being implemented for what might become a critical landing situation. The port engine seized completely as Sarah cleared the valley, forcing her to shut it down and rely entirely on single-engine flight procedures. The starboard engine was still producing power, but oil pressure indicators showed it was also suffering from battle damage sustained during the valley engagement. Flying a damaged A-10 on one engine required all of Sarah's skill and experience. The aircraft's flight characteristics changed dramatically with asymmetric power, requiring constant control inputs to maintain straight and level flight. Fuel consumption increased significantly, raising questions about whether she had enough reserves to reach base. Ground controllers began coordinating with search and rescue assets in case Sarah was forced to eject before reaching friendly territory. The nearest forward operating base was still over an hour away, and her fuel situation was becoming critical with only one engine providing power. But Sarah had not earned the call sign Phoenix by accepting defeat when faced with mechanical emergencies. She settled into the methodical process of emergency flight procedures, determined to bring her damaged aircraft home despite the overwhelming challenges ahead. The long flight home survival against the odds. Sarah's damaged A-10 struggled through the thin mountain air as she began the longest flight of her career. With the port engine completely seized and the starboard engine running on borrowed time, every mile toward Bagram Airfield represented a victory against mechanical failure and hostile territory. The aircraft's normal cruising altitude was impossible with single-engine operation, forcing her to remain at lower altitudes where enemy threats remained a constant concern. The fuel flow indicators told a story that grew more critical with each passing minute. Single-engine operation increased consumption dramatically while reducing her aircraft's range and performance capabilities. Sarah calculated and recalculated her remaining fuel against distance to base, finding the margins uncomfortably thin regardless of how she adjusted her flight profile. Bagram Tower, Phoenix 01 declaring emergency. Single-engine operation following battle damage, estimating base in 47 minutes with minimum fuel reserves. The tower immediately began coordinating emergency response procedures while clearing all other traffic from Sarah's approach path. Fire and rescue vehicles moved into position along the runway, and medical personnel prepared for potential crash landing scenarios. The base commander personally monitored the situation as one of his most experienced pilots fought to bring home a critically damaged aircraft. Radio contact with the extracted SEAL team confirmed that their helicopter had reached friendly territory safely. Chief Thompson's personal message acknowledged what Sarah's low-altitude attack had accomplished. "Phoenix, you delivered exactly what you promised. The package is secure because you made the impossible look routine." But Sarah's focus remained entirely on the immediate challenge of keeping her aircraft airborne. The starboard engine was showing increasing signs of distress, with oil pressure fluctuating and exhaust gas temperatures approaching redline limits. Every engine parameter required constant monitoring as she coaxed maximum performance from her remaining power plant. Mountain terrain stretched endlessly below her flight path, offering no suitable emergency landing sites if complete engine failure occurred. The rocky peaks and narrow valleys that made Afghanistan such challenging terrain for ground forces presented equally deadly obstacles for a pilot attempting emergency procedures in a damaged aircraft. Hydraulic fluid continued leaking from multiple systems, creating a rainbow sheen on her canopy that made visibility increasingly difficult. Sarah wiped the fluid away repeatedly while managing her engine parameters and navigation responsibilities. The A-10's backup flight control systems were functioning, but required significantly more physical effort to operate effectively. 30 minutes into the emergency flight, the starboard engine began surging intermittently. Each power fluctuation sent vibrations through the aircraft that she felt in her bones. Sarah reduced power settings to preserve the engine while accepting reduced airspeed and performance. The careful balance between engine preservation and maintaining flight kept her constantly busy with control inputs. "Phoenix, Bagram Emergency Control, we're showing your altitude decreasing. Are you able to maintain current flight profile?" Sarah checked her altimeter and realized she had been gradually losing altitude as her damaged engine struggled to maintain power. The mountain peaks ahead were higher than her current flight path, requiring her to make a critical decision about engine power settings versus terrain clearance. She advanced the throttle despite the risk to her remaining engine. The starboard power plant responded with reluctant acceleration, providing enough additional thrust to clear the approaching ridgeline. But the increased power demand caused oil pressure to drop further and exhaust temperatures to climb toward dangerous levels. Radio chatter indicated that search and rescue helicopters were being prepared for immediate launch if her aircraft went down in the mountains. The crews were already briefed on her approximate flight path and prepared for combat search and rescue operations in hostile territory if ejection became necessary. Sarah's hands were cramping from the constant pressure required to maintain control of her damaged aircraft. The backup flight control systems lacked power assistance, requiring pure muscle strength to overcome the aerodynamic forces acting on her control surfaces. She adjusted her grip repeatedly to maintain circulation while continuing to fly precisely calculated flight paths. A new problem emerged as electrical systems began failing intermittently. Her primary navigation display flickered and went dark, forcing her to rely on backup instruments and dead reckoning navigation. Radio communication became sporadic as power fluctuations affected her transmission capabilities. The mountains finally gave way to desert terrain as Sarah approached the final approach corridor to Bagram. But her fuel situation had become critical, with gauge readings showing reserves that might not support a standard approach and landing pattern. She requested immediate clearance for a straightened approach that would minimize fuel consumption. Bagram Tower, Phoenix requiring immediate straightened approach. Fuel critical single-engine multiple system failures, rolling out on final approach now. The runway appeared in the distance as Sarah configured her aircraft for landing. The normal approach procedures had to be modified for single-engine operation, requiring different speeds and power settings that she calculated on the fly. Landing a damaged A-10 with minimum fuel and failing systems would test every skill she had developed over 12 years of military flying. Fire trucks were visible along both sides of the runway as emergency crews prepared for potential crash landing scenarios. The tower had cleared all other traffic and activated full emergency procedures, including medical helicopters, standing by for immediate response if required. Sarah's approach speed was higher than normal due to single-engine limitations, but she managed to maintain the precise glide path that would bring her safely to the runway threshold. The starboard engine continued running despite all the abuse it had endured, providing just enough power to complete the approach. The aircraft touched down harder than usual, but Sarah maintained control as the A-10 rolled out along the runway center line. Emergency vehicles paralleled her landing roll, ready to respond immediately if fire or other crisis developed during the landing sequence. As her aircraft finally came to a stop, Sarah realized she had accomplished something extraordinary. Not only had she completed an impossible mission that saved lives, but she had brought her severely damaged aircraft home when conventional wisdom suggested ejection was the only option. The fuel gauges showed empty tanks, confirming that she had landed with virtually no reserves remaining. Ground crews swarmed around her aircraft as Sarah completed shutdown procedures for what remained of her systems. The post-mission inspection would reveal the full extent of battle damage her A-10 had sustained while continuing to fly and fight. Recognition and legacy, the aftermath. Sarah climbed down from her battered A-10 as ground crews began documenting the extensive battle damage her aircraft had sustained. The post-mission inspection revealed over 200 bullet holes, shrapnel damage to both engines, hydraulic system failures, and electrical problems that should have forced emergency landing procedures hours earlier. That her aircraft had continued flying demonstrated both the A-10's legendary durability and Sarah's exceptional skill as a pilot. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell arrived at the flight line as maintenance crews began their detailed damage assessment. His experienced eye immediately recognized the severity of what Sarah had endured during the mission. "Phoenix, I've seen a lot of combat-damaged aircraft over the years, but this is remarkable. How did you manage to keep flying with this level of damage?" The maintenance chief shook his head as he cataloged the holes and system failures. "Ma'am, you should have lost hydraulic pressure completely about 30 minutes into the mission. The fact that backup systems kept functioning with this level of battle damage is extraordinary. This aircraft will require complete rebuilding." News of Sarah's successful mission spread quickly through the military community. The combination of impossible flying and successful hostage rescue created a story that challenged every assumption about A-10 capabilities and pilot limitations. Her achievement became a case study in precision flying under extreme conditions. Chief Thompson and his SEAL team made a special trip to personally thank Sarah for the air support that had saved their mission. The grizzled senior enlisted man who had questioned her capabilities now spoke with deep respect about what she had accomplished. "Major Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. When you said you could fly lower than anyone thought possible, I didn't believe it. What you did in that valley was beyond anything I've seen in 15 years of special operations. You didn't just provide air support, you redefined what's possible." The rescued CIA operative, once he recovered sufficiently to debrief, described hearing the distinctive sound of the GAU-8 cannon during his rescue. "I knew that sound meant American air power, but I never imagined an A-10 could operate in that terrain. The psychological impact on my captors was immediate and complete. They went from confident to panicked in seconds." Sarah's mission report became required reading at the Air Force Weapons School, where instructors used her tactical decisions to illustrate advanced close air support techniques. The low-altitude canyon approach she had pioneered was studied and eventually incorporated into specialized training programs for pilots operating in mountainous terrain. The technical aspects of her flight were analyzed by aircraft manufacturers and military engineers. The single-engine flight procedures she had developed while nursing her damaged A-10 home were incorporated into emergency training curricula. Her ability to maintain controlled flight with multiple system failures provided valuable data for improving aircraft survivability. Recognition came in multiple forms as the military hierarchy acknowledged the significance of her achievement. The Distinguished Flying Cross was awarded for extraordinary heroism during the rescue mission, while the Air Force Association recognized her technical flying skills with their highest pilot achievement award. Media attention followed as news outlets learned about the female major who had accomplished what many considered impossible. Sarah handled the publicity with characteristic professionalism, consistently deflecting credit to her training, her aircraft, and the SEAL team whose lives had depended on her performance. The story resonated particularly strongly with young female pilots entering military service. Sarah began receiving letters from flight training students who drew inspiration from her example. She made time to mentor junior officers, emphasizing that exceptional performance came from dedication to continuous learning rather than inherent advantages. Aircraft manufacturers studied the battle damage her A-10 had sustained while continuing to fly and fight. The data contributed to improvements in aircraft survivability systems and helped validate design decisions that prioritized durability over other performance characteristics. The mission became a benchmark for joint operations between Air Force and Special Operations Command units. The precision coordination between Sarah's air support and the SEAL team's ground operations was analyzed and incorporated into joint training exercises worldwide. Flight training curricula were modified to include Sarah's mission as an example of creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Her willingness to operate outside normal parameters while maintaining safety margins became a case study in risk management and decision-making under combat conditions. Years later, Sarah's achievement continued influencing military aviation. Young pilots learned about the major who flew lower than anyone thought possible and brought her damaged aircraft home through skill and determination. Her story became part of Air Force culture, proving that exceptional performance knows no gender boundaries. The A-10 community adopted her mission as an example of what their aircraft could accomplish in the hands of a skilled pilot willing to push beyond conventional limitations. Her call sign, Phoenix, took on new meaning as the pilot who had risen from seemingly impossible circumstances to accomplish the extraordinary. Sarah continued flying combat missions throughout her deployment, but never again faced circumstances that required the extreme measures she had employed during the hostage rescue. Her reputation spread throughout the theater as the pilot who could accomplish what others considered impossible. The rescued CIA operative made a full recovery and returned to his duties with a new appreciation for the capabilities of American air power. He spoke frequently about the A-10 pilot whose precision flying had saved his life and demonstrated the effectiveness of well-trained personnel operating proven aircraft systems. Chief Thompson's recommendation letter for Sarah's decoration described her performance as the finest example of close air support he had witnessed in his career. His endorsement carried significant weight within the special operations community, where reputation was earned through performance under pressure. Sarah's legacy extended beyond her individual achievement to influence an entire generation of military aviators. Her example proved that excellence in military aviation required not just technical skill, but the courage to attempt what others considered impossible. The mission she had flown became a standard against which other pilots measured their own capabilities and dedication to mission success.